doy la bienvenida al siguiente seminario titulado De la sobrevivencia.
Allow me to welcome you all to our next seminar, which is From Coping to Thriving, Supporting Communities During Shocks. It's an opportunity to discuss how to increase household resilience and how to build communities that can respond and allow for continued progress despite crises.
Our event is in Spanish, English, and Portuguese. We have a wonderful keynote speaker and panelists. Tendremos espacio para preguntas.
We will also have time for a Q&A. You can access it through the QR code that you will see on the screen.
We'll open up to a form where questions will be received. A continuación, pasamos a un video de presentación.
We are now going to have an intro video.
Sin más preámbulos, demos la bienvenida.
Without further ado, let's welcome Alejandro del Valle, an associate professor at Georgia State University. If you can please give him a hand, welcome him to the stage.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la bienvenida.
Thank you very much for welcoming me. It is a pleasure to be with you and talk about how we can take on disasters. Households are facing many impacts, storms, disease, a loss of employment, or price increases. Today I'm going to focus on the risks that come from natural disasters. That's where we have more evidence, and that's also where we have a leading role at the global level. Uninsured risk hurts us twice. First, with the impact, households have to make difficult choices, liquidate assets, pull their children from schools, or fall to predatory lending. This can create scars that will be around for generations. But the second blow can be more silent. Families that have constant risk no longer invest in micro businesses or in other opportunities because they cannot afford to fail. This is why disasters aren't only isolated emergencies. It's actually a systemic break on development that hurts many people and pushes them to poverty every year. In October 2023, Otis hit Acapulco, went from being a tropical storm to a Category 5 in just hours. There was almost no warning. Using satellite imagery, we looked at what happened with inequality. And with this graph, we see what happened with inequality before the storm. That's the line on the bottom compared to what actually happened. And we saw Otis push inequality up by 0.013 points in standard deviation, and that is a huge impact. This is more than just a well-being statistic. This means that in practice, these families have limited access to lending. They're going to have difficulties continuing their education, and it could really erase years of progress. Why does this happen? Because governments have to address their own mission impossible. They're going to have to look at their development budgets, maybe have to make difficult decisions. I'm going to have to wait for international aid. That could take months or perhaps never arrive. And what we see is that lower income countries need 56% more time to recover from their losses than high income countries. The fiscal trap in government reflects the household trap that we have. It increases it, it amplifies it. But the good news is that PAF, this pre-arranged for disaster finance, can give us an idea of what to do. It has specific steps before and post shock so that resources can move around in days and not months. And it helps in two different ways. First, it can prevent damage for families because of how quickly it can be deployed. And secondly, there can be an incentive for households and businesses to invest prior to the storm. But that only happens when the mechanism is ready, and that is what we call money in, money out. Money in has to do with how the financing is funded. There are two different instruments. There are risk instruments with reserves and contingent credit lines, as well as new instruments like CRDCs or the different options to redirect those loans. So the other risks instruments come from risk transfer opportunities, insurance pools, or cat bonds. And that is where Latin America leads the world. We have $7 billion in pre-approved funds that accounts for 75% of global coverage. In addition to that, we have countries like Jamaica that show us what a layered mature system looks like with a CRIF insurance and cat bond. And so when there was a disaster, the resources arrived in days and not months. But funding is just half of the equation. On the money outside, how do funds reach individuals? That requires a number of different networks for deployment for different situations. Some for building roads, and that's what we see in Fondem, for example, in Mexico. Others, like for droughts, require direct household support, rapid transfers so that households don't need to use up all their cash just to survive. Some cases require both. With the experience in our seed and the Dominican Republic show us the value in having that direct support and reconstruction support. And so what we want to do is build that delivery response, delivery capacity rather. And so we will hear here on the panel, this goes beyond just a budget line item. What does the evidence say? I have spent years studying the Fonden in Mexico. It was the first index to disaster funds in the world, and the results speak for themselves. It ensured with a 1x of fiscal multiplier investments. For every peso in reconstruction, we saw 1 peso in the fiscal multiplier. But Fonden also reduced post-disaster mortality by 75%. That was a $3.2 increase for every dollar invested. When the design and delivery are done right, agreed upon financing is not a risky, costly endeavor. It can help economies be better protected. This isn't an isolated case either. Around the world, we see a number of different examples. We see the poverty trap and how assistance in the right time can help break that. We have that in Costa Rica with the drought, in Bangladesh with early transfers, which reduce the food insecurity and the liquidation of assets after the storms. And so the message is clear when it comes to risk management. Reducing response time equals increasing resilience. And the best part is that this region isn't starting from scratch. The region has been a pioneer with CCRIF and others, all first of its kind. It also helps that there are a number of different elements and registries that can help with these issues. Disasters can also affect those who are outside of the system. We must know that those who are either poor, working informally, or more vulnerable. And so to adapt, we don't need to invent, we need to grow and integrate. Horizontal expansion to reach those who are vulnerable and exposed to risk. digitalization and geolocalization of those at risk, but more than anything else, we need to break silos. In many of our countries, risk management and the finance ministry and other agencies don't share data or budgets. And so we need to tap into those resources, not reinvent the wheel. Let's focus on where innovation is coming from. The first has to do with early action, paying households before the shock hits. If there's a forecast for a hurricane, transfers leave 3 days early, with liquidity being provided to households to take protective actions. Secondly, building back better. Every asset damage creates an opportunity, and we can use that to help in the future. Reconstruction shouldn't only focus on going back to what there was, but rather investing in the infrastructure so that we could be resilient to the next disaster. And third, a tailored guidance approach. And so the same pipes that we use to deliver money at first can be used for these new needs. The same way that payments are delivered in one way can also help provide tailored solutions at scale. But here's what is difficult. The financial innovation that leads to the payments also create a baseline risk that is a tax on trust. The government can do everything right, save, plan, but on day zero, then the payments don't come through. And that can be a big blow. And so we know how to address those different issues. Institutionally, there can be contingency funds and appeals mechanisms and transparent reforms. All of these are needed. Where do we take the first step? There is no silver bullet, but there are 3 ways in which support from the IDB could, in my view, really help. The first is layered financing. Reserves plus contingent credit plus risk transfer. So not any single instrument. It's a portfolio. Now, of course, this portfolio is going to look different for different countries depending on their risk profile. The second is delivery readiness, with registries and payment mechanisms and protocols, all settled before the shock and not after. These need to be established ahead of time. And last, basis risk governance. I want to focus on that. Having audit triggers and grievance channels, contingency top-ups. When there are failures, governance is what helps sustain the trust. We want to ensure that the protection is by design and not luck. We want not just coping, but thriving. Natural disasters can be addressed. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, Alejandro.
Valeria Piñeiro, representante regional para América.
Regional Representative for Latin America and the Caribbean and Senior Research Coordinator at IFPRI. Valeria, welcome. Priscila Santana, Secretary of Finance, Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil. Wayne Henry,
of Jamaica's Planning Institute. And Juan Pablo Bonilla, Manager of the Sustainable Development Sector of the IDB, who will moderate this panel. Juan Pablo, el micrófono es tuyo.
Juan Pablo, the mic is yours. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank Alejandro. That was an excellent presentation, and it gives us very important input for the conversation we're about to have. And also, I wanted to thank all of the panelists for being with us this afternoon. Now, you probably saw in Alejandro's presentation, he divided this into 3 blocks. First, he looked at the impact on households. So I'm going to be asking you questions to get into that. And then second, the importance of creating response systems. And third, as you showed us, Alejandro, towards the end of your presentation, you were talking about getting the transfer mechanisms in place. Now, as they said already, we have interpretation to English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So let's begin with impact on households. Valeria, you have looked at the impact of different shocks, pandemics, other disasters. How do families respond to different shocks? Well, first of all, thank you very much for that question. And I'm going to try to add to what Alejandro said and also emphasize different types of shocks that may not be climate related. As you said, I think that COVID did help us. We called this 3C crisis. That was conflict. Also, we had problems with health and climate. So those were three elements that represent a crisis. Families react differently according to the type of crisis that they are involved in. But there's also a lot of heterogeneity across families themselves, rural, urban, regardless of the quintile. But there are some things that we can say, some things that can be generalized. And that is families follow certain steps. When there's a shock, usually it's a liquidity constraint, and the first thing they try to do is to protect their income. So they try to diversify the labor force, they try to shift to another sector, perhaps they get a second job, perhaps at night, or they have to work with other family members that in case they have a family business. So they try to diversify that part. Then second, they try to find some sort of social support. It could be remittances sometimes, but also support from their family. Now, in the case of COVID, this was harder because everyone was affected. That means that this was less of a possibility. And then third, they also look to transfers from the government. That would be cash transfers in general. And also another important thing is Social Security. That would be pensions and also different types of insurance. For example, unemployment insurance. Now, these are important. Then there are two things that especially produce harm in the long term to these families. It may be a good solution for the short term, but this affects the potential livelihood or income potential in the long term. And then second, and Alejandro mentioned this, is that they sell tools, machinery, things that families need to continue to produce. So that on one hand. But the second thing is they try to borrow. Often they are able to get liquidity from a loan, but often in unfavorable conditions. And then third, they try to affect consumption. They diversify their diet, not improving the diet, but often lowering the quality of their diets. And this especially affects children that wind up having long-term problems. So that in terms of families. Now, these strategies have to have a relationship with institutions in each country, and of course there are policies being made by different agencies. A lot depends on the fiscal space available to governments, and also a lot has to do with the financial infrastructure, the digitalization that exists in each country. And then lastly, and I have worked with agriculture for a long time, so you have the matter of food security. That too can be affected in terms of the agri-food systems. We saw that in COVID, but we also saw that when Russia invaded Ukraine, with all of the problems caused in transport, etc. So there is a cost, and yes, markets do adjust, but the cost affects not only countries, they wind up affecting the affordability of goods. And so that is a very important factor. Thank you. Now, Alejandro, you said something that was very important, and that is that mortality after disaster can go up. So there is a big impact on human capital. Children drop out of school, for example. So, what would you say about that looking to the future, talking not only about what can be done, but if these are pressing issues? Well, in terms of these issues, frontier issues, right now we have a lot of evidence that points to the fact that anticipatory action, in other words, making payments before the disaster hits, is something that can be very helpful, but also there are some problems. It doesn't always work. It works when we can identify the actions that families can take to protect themselves. So there is a potential to improve the response, because if you can take anticipatory action, that has to go hand in hand with customized information. So say to a family, this is what you can do to protect yourself. I understand you may be having liquidity problems, so what you could do to protect your liquidity is X. So that action prior to the disaster can protect the families. Now, if families depend on public assets, another important thing is better reconstruction. So every time that something bad happens, if we lose an asset, we have to rebuild. So are we going to rebuild in a dangerous place, or should we move that asset to a safer site? We have to build infrastructure in such a way that it can deal with future disasters. Now, I'm thinking about poverty. Who loses the most? Well, that is something that we're studying. I don't think that we understand the distributive effects of disasters, but we see that inequality does increase after disasters. But what I do want to say is that when we look at the neighborhoods that initially were more unequal, are they more affected? What we find is that the inequality actually decreases resilience and increases the damage. Now, we don't know if it's because of a loss of social cohesion, but if this is true, there is a room here for policy, because we are trying to decrease inequality, right? And so if we look at that inequality, a consequence of inequality is that hopefully we can increase the resilience to disaster. So that would be an additional benefit. Okay, let's talk about response systems in coordination. So here we can talk about Wayne and Priscilla.
Suffered from Melissa last year. It was for the first time a hurricane level 5. The way you have coordinated among different institutions has been very important, not only for us at the ADB, but for other countries to learn about that. Could you share with the audience that experience, not only your institution, the Planning Institute, but in general, how was the coordination mechanism in Jamaica before and to respond after Melissa?
So thank you very much, Juan Pablo, and thank you for having me on the panel. So Jamaica has, and pre-Melissa, has had a very robust disaster risk management framework in place. And it involves early warning systems where we have a warning on flood alerts. We have river gauges where if the water goes beyond a certain level, it triggers an alert to our water resource authority. We can close vulnerable roadways because if rivers are a risk. We have people get alerts on their devices, so we utilize technology. We have a natural disaster risk management council, which is chaired by our Prime Minister, so at the very highest level. And that council has several committees looking at emergency response, looking at health response, humanitarian support, looking at public information and awareness, and of course, recovery planning. So my institution, the Planning Institute of Jamaica, we chair the Recovery Planning Committee that coordinates among ministries, departments, agencies, public service providers to have an informed mechanism where we engage and determine the priorities for recovery, reconstruction, recovery, restoration following a disaster. And importantly, we lead on the process of doing a detailed damage and loss assessment of any disaster. So you can have some rapid response, give you a crude estimate, but we would have the teams that would have training in what we call our damage and loss methodology or our post-disaster needs assessment. And we would do a detailed damage assessment on the disaster. So for example, for Melissa, which occurred on October 28, 2025 in Jamaica, we've estimated that damage, overall damage and loss, as well as additional costs of the hurricane to be some $12.2 billion US, which is over 56% of our GDP. So something that was very surprising was the strength and magnitude, the intensity of the hurricane. And so you're looking at a system that can last a few or maybe several hours, but has long-term impacts. You're looking at loss of life, in some cases loss of livelihoods. You're looking at damage to infrastructure, whether loss of electricity, loss of water supply, and these can affect people and communities for a relatively long time. And so as we do the coordination, we formulate a plan informed by the assessment to determine what our reconstruction would look like. We've estimated that in this case to be between 3 to 5 years to get to these levels. And we would say pre-Melissa levels, but really we want to build forward better. So we have to improve our resilience as we reconstruct and recover.
Very good. Thank you, Anna. We were talking before about the importance of early warning systems. How was your experience in Melissa with that? Because you told me something very important last night, and it's about creating trust based on data. Please share with the audience, how was the whole experience?
So as we said, Juan Pablo, there is a robust system that provides early warnings. We have the Doppler radar. We have a lot of weather gauges, what we call automatic weather stations that the IDB had helped us to set up. Several locations throughout the island, which generates data and can provide those information, that data, to the public. And people have through social media, through their cell phones, people are warned. What we found is that because of maybe distrust, sometimes when we give the warnings to the public, people may be slow to respond. So we say there is a category 5 hurricane coming. We need to persons in flood-prone areas or low-lying areas and at higher risk or more vulnerable, you need to go into shelters. We found that people were not responding. Sometimes because we've had so many episodes in the Caribbean that people after a while, for Jamaica's case, we haven't had that direct hit. People would want to stay and say it's not going to impact me. I can ride it out, I don't have to move. But as we continue to intensify the alert, we continue to appeal to persons with data and call for more. At the 11th hour, we call it very late in the day, we saw shelters being populated. People were actually moving. Fisher folk were pulling their boats offshore. So people began to respond as we continue to make the call. So our point one, Pablo, is that we have to develop that trust. Sometimes people are skeptical. We hear it a lot in the Caribbean. We have almost every year we have some episode. And here we are, we've survived it. Now comes our category 5, the largest ever impact on the Jamaican in history. And I think that would be a case in point that should we give a warning again, I'm sure people respond much faster.
Thank you, Gwen. Priscilla, you also suffer from también sufrieron, disculpa, vamos a hablar.
You suffered too, so I don't know why I was speaking English, but you were really affected by the flooding. And we were talking about the consortium, and what you told us yesterday I found of great interest. You talked about interstate coordination in Brazil, so please share that with the audience. Yes, we have a complex structure in Brazil. We have a very diverse networking where each municipality has its own characteristics. So with a disaster of this size that we were discussing, and if you're talking about the state, Brazil, we have 497 municipalities, and of the 490 some, 78 were severely affected by the 2024 rain. Now, at different levels of severity, yes, but affected in terms of the need and their ability to respond. Now, initially, and this was a lesson for Brazilian states, and after the pandemic, what we found was that together, by cooperation, showing solidarity, we were able to produce better results. So, based on those arrangements, there were different arrangements, states, municipalities, etc., different and coordination mechanisms were set up, different consortia of states, and in the southern region, they established a consortium with several different provinces, and that consortium worked on taking initial action, which was moving rescue workers to save lives. Another thing that has to be kept in mind is saving lives. So they mobilized resources quickly, air forces. Also, in that way, they all worked together. And then later on, after that initial reaction to the disaster, people began to work together on prevention. And that is what was our major lesson. Now, the ability, and that was important well into the pandemic, but people learned how to buy together. Procurement was done. So, in that way, they applied those lessons learned to the disaster. Now, for example, they're building a hydrological center to monitor climate, and that is an expense that is being shared amongst the partners. Also, training of professionals is something that could be shared. We have different teams that are sharing their knowledge, their expertise with neighboring states. So that was a learning process. And this is something that the disaster taught Rio Grande do Sul. So this is expensive for a developing country like Brazil, where the economic conditions require being prepared across the board. This is necessary to divide risks, and for that, the consortia have been a good response. Now, please, if anyone has any question, if there's anything that you're thinking about as you listen to our panelists, please put it in the system using the QR. Now, you talked about COVID, you talked about food prices and how families react to early alerts, or do you think that this is something that we can research together? Well, first of all, thank you for that question. Now, an early alert, that is definitely tremendously important. Now, something that we are working on right now is related to what Alejandro was saying. This is something we're doing in IFPRI. Now, we have to look at how families benefit from early action in the sense of if they receive a cash transfer, they receive whatever is needed before the shock or the crisis hits. In that way, they are in a better position and they don't have to sell their assets or suffer food insecurity. Now, and also the timing of when they receive that assistance is key. We have to focus on that. We have to look at the scale, but that is exactly what we have been working on. Now, especially in terms of, we were working in Bangladesh, we were working on floods. That is something that you mentioned. And there has been a great improvement in weather forecasting with AI, and now that indicator that was mentioned by Indicator is improved upon, and that affects cost benefit. Early action, early payment really does help avoid losses, whether or not the crisis doesn't actually happen, or if it didn't affect the population, if they've already received the money compared to those that did not. It's important to be able to anticipate, to foresee. Now, when you're putting together an early warning system, there is an additional benefit in addition to saving lives, forecasting weather. Wayne has his system. He has gathered data for 10 or 20 years, and if he needs to explore a cat bond or reinsure, if we have that data, we get better price. So he can buy that insurance in a more favorable position. So there's fiscal benefits in addition to doing things that are good for the population. Perfect. And now to get to financial architecture, we're talking about anticipating. That requires resources too. Alejandro, you said that depending on each country's risk profile, there's not a sole instrument. There's a whole package of instruments. Today, the president of the bank was talking about a whole series of instruments where we have approved new instruments to deal with disasters. So I wanted to talk about funding and how important that funding is in Mexico. Now, how replicable is that across the region? I think it's quite replicable. I'm not saying that each country needs to have a Fonden, but there are parts that can be applied. The fact that we have $7 billion in BUF means that a lot of the funding is already in the region. Now, funding is in contingent lines and reserves, so there is space to think about transferring risk. And here there are experiences with CLIP that shows how different countries can join together to get better conditions by transferring risk. So we have learned a lot thanks to Fonden, and we see other countries engaged in doing something similar. Then, in terms of delivery mechanisms, Fonden focuses on reconstruction, and there's something that I have learned by working with you, and that is that the IDB does a fantastic job reminding us about reconstruction. We also have some social protection systems in Fonden, and we can turn those into adaptive social protection. So if we already have all these mechanisms in place, we can join that with financing. So this is a great time to do that. Now, there are several lessons from Fonden. First of all, one of our key ingredients is speed. It's not only having the money has to get into the right hands at the right time, and that means a good bureaucracy. And using these instruments, they have to be modern, we have to have well-built triggers. And the second lesson from Fonden is that more than money, what we need is the institutions. We need there to be a legal framework that would say what is insured, who is insured, what is the reconstruction process, how can we indemnify for the damages that took place. So governments need to learn the insurance business. This is everyday business for an insurance company. So I emphasize the legal framework because if people think that the insurance is in place, what is going to happen is that the businesses and families will invest in a way that they didn't before because no longer are they worried about risk. So that is also a spillover benefit.
How did you use them for respond to the impact?
So thank you. We had a layered approach, as Alejandro mentioned and presented. And we found that as you tailor the instrument to specific conditions for payout, you get better terms in terms of pricing and conditions. So we have at the very base what we call our national natural disaster fund, and that's just a budget allocation where we put some billions in the budget, and that's your first call depending on the scale or magnitude of damage. And then beyond that, we would have specific instruments. We have a catastrophe bond. That would be some, maybe US, in our case, US 185 million payout from some of our development partners. And the IDB has been instrumental also because we would have also a conditional credit facility, CCF, and that's part of your conditional credit line where you have prearranged mechanisms in place and protocols so that when the disaster comes, you don't have to wait, you can draw down quickly. And then beyond that, we would have our, what Alejandro mentioned also, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, what we call the CRIF. And that's a parametric insurance model that is really at the highest level. A finance minister once joked that says we have to all be wiped out to get a payout. But it's important to have these mechanisms in place, because when a disaster hits, you can't be waiting for disbursement. You can't be lining up. There are immediate needs and you have to respond very quickly. So that's been very instrumental for us, and we've seen those benefits having put that work in place.
When Alejandro mentioned the importance of having an instrument to provide resources in advance to communities. Before that, according to the systems and alerts, early warning, did you have that type of instrument? Do you think it's a new instrument that we could work together for the future, not only in Jamaica, but in the region?
I think we've been leaning forward in continuing to broaden that portfolio of options. And I think what's been very commendable for the IDB and other development partners is that pivoting, that creativity in terms of being responsive, particularly to the needs of the Caribbean. And we said the Latin American and Caribbean region. We are probably the second highest in the world for vulnerability to these natural disasters. And we've seen the willingness of IDB and others to move away from traditional engagement and traditional lending programs and policies. And that's been extremely useful to us.
Thank you, Wayne. I was asking because as part of the new instruments, we're working together with the Social Protection Department to what Alejandro mentioned, to have instruments in advance linked to the contingency or different, to have that type of resources for adaptive protection in advance for family using these different networks, social networks that you mentioned, Alejandro. Priscila, misma pregunta para ti.
The same question for you, Priscilla, as Secretary of Finance of Rio Grande do Sul. So a natural disaster hits, and what happens? Well, the fund would be an excellent solution for Brazil. Now, what is a challenge? The budget in Brazil is very based on annual payments. So a fund of these characteristics would, and I am a person that recognizes the political legitimacy of doing allocation of resources. But in Brazil, our major challenge is annually submitting the fund to a legislative budgetary process that can lead to withdrawal of the resources. So there, I think that is an issue that, and here I'm sharing this, we're talking in generalities, but is something that does affect Brazil and Brazilians, and a lot has to do with the culture of resilience. To know that the disaster is going to happen. It didn't happen this year, it didn't happen yesterday, but it may hit, it may occur. So to know that resources of this nature require a change of culture, and this is something we're building in Brazil. You have to be able to build within the budget of Brazil, within the framework of the budget. You have to have a climatic budget where everyone is committed to preserving it. I can have tags for these outlays, but we also have to look at prevention, mitigation, and that is something very hard to transfer, to communicate through an annual debate where they are debating over the budget. So what were we doing in Rio Grande do Sul? Here we have the perspective of taking these lessons to Brazil in general. Building that budget, it is not something where it is parallel. It is not that. It is resilient budget. Fine, we talked about the warning system, the alert system, and some of you referred to the importance of creating resilience. Now, Alejandro, you talked about build back better.
How are you thinking in terms of reconstruction to include resiliency across the design of the new infrastructure? Speaking about energy, about housing, hospitals, how are you incorporating that even with the private sector in PPPs, for example?
So thank you. For building resilience, and we speak about building forward better, it's about if you simply reconstruct and recover to pre-disaster levels, you're going back to pre-disaster risk, the risk that existed to bring you to a point. You have to, in reconstructing, in recovering, you have to reduce vulnerabilities. What a disaster does, it reveals the vulnerabilities. And I think the efforts to build resilience are about, I would say, we use the term stress testing, but identifying those vulnerabilities and taking action, putting in place investments to reduce those vulnerabilities. So very important. And I think, somebody would argue that if you don't plan properly, right, and the types of resources, somebody says it costs you to build resilience, but not putting in place resilience is more costly than the outlay of being resilient. And so it's very important as we go forward. And so in our case, we look at lessons learned, even though we had robust systems, is that the disasters are more intense. And so we have to build even more resilience to reduce those vulnerabilities. We have to look at putting in place redundancies that says if your electricity supply, your water supply goes, your housing stock goes, how do you put in place? And a diversification, both from just direct investment as well as utilizing spatial planning. We have a tool now where we can identify what we call hotspots of the most vulnerable areas in the country, vulnerable to these disasters, and then to look at our productive assets, how do we protect them, and how do we do what we call spatial allocation around. Part of the challenge for Jamaica from a food security standpoint is those parishes most affected, the areas, the regions most affected from this hurricane was constituted up to maybe 70% of our agricultural production. So then how can we then going forward better diversify our agricultural production so that if a disaster hits one area, we have redundancies in place? How do we diversify our energy mix so that if electricity goes down, and some of our water supply is based on electricity in terms of the pumps and generation, well, what can we put in place in terms of solar and other mechanisms? So we have tremendous lessons learned that we seek to employ. And crowding in the private sector is important. Jamaica has done a lot of work, as you know, over the last 10, 15 years in reducing our debt burden to crowd in the private sector. And we've been very successful at that. But one issue of vulnerability of small island developing states is that even after all that hard work, you get a category 5 and it sets you back. And so we rely more on the private sector to bring in resources to scale up a lot of these interventions and investments. And so we're very hopeful as we move forward in that process. And then also the final thing I think is doing more in terms of public awareness. Even though we have the early warning systems and we get the message out, we have to do more public education so people understand. I think we have the case in point of category 5 impacting us as it did, that people will get the message quicker because it's a lived experience. But I think especially for generations coming, that we have to do more to create that awareness of the damage that can be done and the benefit of preparedness and resilience.
Thank you, Wayne. I'm receiving a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to pass to the questions. La primera pregunta nos...
The first question is from Pilar, rather. It is linked to what we had this morning with the CSO discussion. Are there response mechanisms for emergencies or early action that can be implemented through civil society? Priscila?
Observou que
In the case of Brazil, we saw that the commitment of society, of communities, and this was important in terms of a disaster in Rio Grande do Sul, and that followed a logic where the whole state was involved, and then that had to do with the river basins. So the flood began in the north of the state, and then 3 days later, there was flooding in the northeast, and then people were following the flow of the water, and they knew that the water was coming. They knew that 5 or 6 days in advance. And here, and I am really sorry that so many lives were lost, but they saw the size of the disaster. And we had thought that it might be even worse, but it was because society's mobilized. So the communities, the churches, the social assistance centers, and They knew that in 3 days flooding would begin. So they began to mobilize efforts. They also were places where civil society was active, and that was important in terms of causing the information to get out.
I think civil society has a tremendous role to play. We've seen in Jamaica's case a tremendous civil society response, a lot of faith-based institutions providing shelter, a lot of persons in communities rallying support and relief. Even when the government said, try to keep the roadways clear for emergency vehicles, people were just volunteerism and the spirit of volunteerism. Tremendous in Jamaica's case, tremendous, overwhelming. And even the diaspora and friends of Jamaica from outside the country sending tremendous levels of relief and support. Civil society rallying and that call, that resilience that we see, that spirit of optimism is largely sustained and driven by civil society. So I think civil society has a tremendous role. And they've stepped forward, in this case in Jamaica, very supportive, very instrumental. And I think going forward, it's going to need, just as you've said, Priscilla, that collaborative effort and all of us joining hands to really get this heavy work done.
Thank you, Wayne. Esta pregunta viene de Paola.
We have a question from Paola. For Alejandro, perhaps, to begin. The countries most exposed to shocks tend to be the ones with the least amount of fiscal capacity. Is that right? How can these countries be better prepared to take on these events? Depends on the shock, I'd say. If it's hydrometeorological, yes. But I think the answer is like what we heard about the CRIF. That the countries can't come together and have more favorable conditions. That's the experience that we got from the CRIF. And so a small island is going to try to get financing by using different risk transfer mechanisms. It's going to be very costly for one single island. But if you're a consortium, if you have 23 countries, which is what happens with the CRIF, the conditions can be a lot more favorable. And so the mechanism involves coming together. And the other side of it is planning. So money is important, but it's interesting to have the institutions and the laws that allow for that work to begin. So it's not only about just the funding, but taking that first step. How do we get the house in order? Thank you very much. We got a very important question coming in, Valeria. You talked a lot about food. What role do you see for the private sector to ensure there is food available during these kinds of events? I see this more from an affordability perspective. It's really about households not only having access, but also being able to pay for what they need. In terms of the private sector, we've seen that in all of the previous crises we've had, the private sector continues to work. The food industry was one of the most resilient during COVID. So it's not so much a question of whether there will be food available. I think, again, it's more about households being able to gain access to it. Now, that said, there are a few things that can be done in terms of governments and countries trying to keep the market as free as possible, not, for example, having export restrictions in place. That was a problem because that led to a lot of that price volatility that in some way affects the consumer, but also affects the producer upstream. And so there are a few things that can be done, but if I had to boil it down to one thing, is trying to keep markets as free as possible. Thank you very much. I have another question here from Pablo, who's asking, of course, about how important it is for finance ministers. We're going to have our assembly soon, but if you were to talk to your country's finance minister, we've talked about a lot of different things and all the things that are needed to be ready to respond, to build back better, and address issues like social protection. What would be one suggestion you would give to your finance minister to address different types of shocks? Alejandro, to start with you. Well, mine is difficult because it goes beyond the executive. It really has to do with the legislature. And so I think the first thing that needs to happen is have a legal framework that have these prearranged financing go through automatic disbursements. And then once it happens, then the executive can come in to implement. But it needs to be a law that goes beyond any one administration for people to understand that it's arrived and will stick around. Understanding also what the benefits are is important, so the households will learn that they can invest differently because those risks aren't going to affect them the same way. And so they'll believe us. And so it's hard. You have to get the legislature on board and convince them to pass a bill. Valeria? I see it as infrastructure, needing to be prepared and having things working before the shock hits. One thing is being ready and the other is being reactive. When the shock hits and you have to react, things take a lot of time to work, if they work at all. One of the things that we've said here is that the timing regarding when the assistance comes in to a household is key. So working on a program that works, that's it. There's more evidence, for example, from COVID, the countries that already had a social protection program that was working well, it was, in other words, well designed, that provided digital access to its participants already, and also had that systematized payment system. They dealt with COVID better. That's what we saw in Mexico and in Brazil. And so, again, being ready to stay away from having to react to what happens. Thank you. Priscilla?
I would say the same. Now, what is the challenge? To be prepared for the event. And to that end, you have to do your homework in advance. In the case of Brazil, something that facilitates things is that we have very well-structured databases. We have what we call a cadastre, and there you can quickly reach those who are in the greatest need. In the case of Rio Grande do Sul, we made the first payments in 48 hours to those who were most affected. That was important because we had the address, and part of the payment was also automatic. So the first thing that you have to do is have a strong, robust regulatory framework so as to make payment automatic, so that there is no doubt about deviation of payments, fraud. So you need a very up-to-date database, and that is something that takes work, that takes money, but you should never lose that point of reference. And then something else that I already mentioned, and that is the need to have a separate shielded budget so as to deal with the needs and the calamities that are going to come, that may not come this year in the case of Brazil, but they will come at some point, and that is important for the protection.
As Valeria Priscilla said, having those activities before an event, those pre-disaster activities to build resilience. We can't wait until a disaster and then we are reacting, but really trying to identify those areas of vulnerability and really tackle them before it happens. And so you're looking at resilient infrastructure, just as you've said, where you identify your productive assets and where they're located and how do you protect them in terms of building resilience there. I think that's very important also. Having social registries where you know where people are. So if systems collapse, you can still know how to reach. The community mapping. Communities are different. What are the needs and characteristics across in terms of spatial locations, the differences. Very important. And so those activities being put in place that can help you in an event if you know, and the redundancies that says if the systems go down, how do we continue? How do we do a response in terms of transfers? COVID showed us lessons. I think it's important that we learn the lessons because sometimes we have these episodes and events that happen and we don't do sufficient learning. And so it's not enough to say monitoring and evaluation, but we have to incorporate the learnings and how do we go forward better, having learned from this experience. I think as a region, we can do this kind of exercise, knowledge sharing. As President Elan said, it's so important that we have these dialogues so we learn from each other. And you don't have to go through my experience to learn from it, right? You can hear and take the lessons learned, and I think that's very important. So the dialogue is important, how we engage with each other, how we derive the lessons learned, and importantly, put in place those investments, those outlays, those costs, because if you don't, it's going to cost you even more.
Thank you, Wayne. Me llegó una pregunta muy interesante.
We also got a very interesting question that came in. It is linked to Anna's previous panel. Can you talk to us about the risk of having or not having infrastructure for care for children or the elderly if there's a shock? I'll start. What's interesting, when you look at the mortality profile in Mexico, you think about disasters, and what's hard to understand is that the tail is very long. And so, for the most part, you think that people die directly after a disaster, but most deaths come indirectly in the months following a disaster. That is when you lose access to the healthcare system. That's what leads to deaths. And what I did in working for the fund in Mexico let me see that non-communicable diseases, that was a big factor. And the data, we were looking at it, we saw that people with 65 who are 65 or older tended to die more linked to these disasters. They lose access, for example, to insulin if they need it, or other medication. Also, that readiness before disaster strikes, having that access to somebody that can help them keep those systems connected, that was also a key part of it. And so the idea here is to understand, once the system breaks down, how do you quickly get it back online? Because what we see is that when you look at deaths from disasters, not everybody dies at the same time. What we need is to make sure that we have keep track of all of it. Thank you. Yes, those who are 65 or older, and also talking about child care. So women who then have to stay at home and then lose that source of income. They can't go to work anymore, and that's key during a crisis. But I did want to go back to the idea of that early action. We've been talking about this, and it's one of what I think is the more interesting things that we see coming out of the research. We still see a lot of missing information when it comes to evidence. That evidence gap requires more work. And it's promising, but there are two things that we need to work on. One is a change in narrative. Up until now, we have talked about what happens when the shock strikes. When that happens, then what do? There are countries that were already prepared, but they have to wait for the shock to strike to then take action or have something happen. That's what we've been working on. This isn't only governments that have to think this way, but thinking about the entire financial system usually operates the same way. This is a great opportunity that we have here to actually bring about that change in narrative. And the other, when it comes to evidence, has to do with this kind of action. There is evidence that shows that there can be some automatic shocks. For example, flooding was something that was mentioned today. There is less evidence around how to design programs for the shocks that take longer to build. For example, drought. That kind of research would be really important to work on.
I wanted to share with you the experience in Rio Grande. It has a lot to do with what I mentioned, and that is the need for a good database. Now, our social coverage policy is integrated. We have programs for early childhood. We have different programs, and all of that is part of the same cadastre. Now, what happens when that is being used? Since you already have the cadastre of those in greatest need, and you know the flood and where it is, then you know who in that group is elderly. And so there, our Secretariat of Health sent out people to deal with that population. For children also, there was a policy that was systematized so as to vaccinate. So there is an integration of public policy through the database, and that provides social coverage instead of everyone working in an isolated fashion.
Can I say, at the Planning Institute, I chair what we call a National Social Protection Committee. that brings together the various stakeholders representing and our vulnerable population includes senior citizens, of course the elderly, children, persons with disabilities. And so it's a continuous process of how do we build resilience for them. And so because we are so susceptible, if you will, vulnerable to natural disasters, in terms of disaster risk management and resilience building must incorporate them. And so it's an ongoing process, and the coordination is important because you can't capture everything. But as the different stakeholders come together, that remains very important. Sometimes we do policies that we think are effective, but as we get the feedback, and that feedback loop is important for us to continue to improve processes. So we want to say this process of resilience building is a continuous, ongoing process. It's unfortunately for us in the Caribbean and the region, really, the LATAM region, is that it's not a occasional occurrence, right? Yeah. Natural disasters is part of our daily existence, and we have to plan properly, and it's something that we have to continue to work at.
Thank you, Wayne. Esta pregunta me parece interesantísima.
This question I think is really interesting. It's from Luciana. It says, many neighborhoods and communities that are disaster or exposed to disasters are in unauthorized, more precarious areas. And so what preventive action can be taken so that there can be adequate resettlement for these communities? I think it's a great question around planning and resources. Anyone who wants to answer? Well, I can talk to you about Fondem. And when this started, and maybe I'll give you the backstory. Fonden would build these houses in Mexico, and this was for people who had a history of poverty. And so what happened was that a lot of these houses that it was working with were actually dwellings that were very dangerous because they were informal. And so there was a change in the rules. The assistance to families was going to continue, but in dangerous areas that was not going to be allowed. And so what we said was, let's take that opportunity to move them to a safer place. And so the idea was to think that every disaster actually creates an opportunity. And in this case, it was about moving to a safer area. Thank you, Alejandro. Anyone else?
Tenho uma experiência interessante.
In Brazil's case, we had an interesting experience. We had resources that had been appropriated, and we were able to remove the people from the risk area in year 1, year 2, year 3. But in year 4, they went back. So what you need, in addition to that whole effort of resettlement, is giving them an opportunity in those areas so as to make them resilient. And that in the case of Brazil, perhaps those areas might be flooded again, because otherwise these people do move back, and it has to be a long-term public policy where it's not only a matter of resettling, but also you have to provide good conditions in that new area.
Activity of social housing, and particularly for lower income persons, affordable housing, and that present the opportunity, as Alejandro said, to position persons, locate them in safer areas. We've had in times past, because of past disasters, where we provide housing for persons, just similar to the case in Brazil, and sometime after they return, they rent the houses that they had provided for them and return to the previous locations. And so part of the process would involve public awareness and a sort of public education, and then enforcement to say you can't return to those areas. So I think certainly now, because housing is such a large component of the recovery effort for us following Melissa, that we have opportunity, and the government has been articulating the solutions around putting persons in safer areas and even more resilient buildings. Sometimes our building code has been very robust, but sometimes the enforcement to ensure that people are building according to the stipulated codes. And so there's more effort that we'll put in that process at a time like this, looking at the opportunities created.
Listening to you, Wayne, I just had another idea, which is that many times we don't know that these places are actually dangerous, right? So a very important public good is actually telling people which are the dangerous areas. And so the risk mapping that you're doing is not only for the government to plan, it's also to tell people so that that can be priced into the price of land. So this is an opportunity to do that as well.
And so coming back to the point of trust, sometimes you provide the information and people may be skeptical and slow to respond. So you have to build that social capital so that there's a type of outcome you want.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Tengo por lo menos.
Well, thank you very much. I have at least 10 more questions, but I was just told that we are running out of time. I did want to conclude thanking you all for this very interesting discussion, and wanted to let the audience know, as the president said during the opening, for the bank at the group level. Right now, the priority is to be prepared and build resilience. We have a really important program right now called Ready and Resilient in the Americas. And it seeks to address a number of different challenges and opportunities that you have all raised. And so we're ready to work with all of you. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos.
Thank you.
Agradezco.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Thank you, Juan Pablo, and thank you to all of the panelists for your contributions, your clarity, and your commitment to these very pressing challenges.
Moderators, participants, and the audience online. Con esta conversación,
With this panel, we come to the close of a day full of deep thought. On the one hand, how can our societies turn the demographic shifts in our region into an economic opportunity? And on the other hand, also how to become stronger in the face of the shocks that affect households. Tomorrow we're going to pick it back up at 9 a.m. with an agenda full of discussions on competition, value chains, regional integration, and a business forum that's going to bring together key business leaders from the region.
to continue with a wonderful program. Don't miss it. Bye-bye.
Join us in Paraguay on March 11 to 14 for our most important gathering, the IDB Group's annual meeting. Last year was the IDB Group's record year, with the highest ever level of $35 billion in financing, while strengthening the quality of our projects and processes, and therefore delivering impact. This led us to a year of record recognition, including Multilateral Development Bank of the Year. Now, we need to build on that. The IDB Group will focus on growth, has foundation for development, including private sector network, critical minerals, supply chains, supporting countries in economic transition, and advancing integration among those ready to move. Annual meetings will have four main elements. First, conversation with the civil society organizations. Second, thematic seminars on topics like aging, resilience to shocks, competition for growth, among several others. Our private sector business forum will have several panels, small gatherings, but also bilaterals. And last but not least, our official governance agenda, where we will discuss our IDB Impact Plus and the new capitalization and business models of IDB Invest and IDB Lab. You also hear more about initiatives like La Crece, IDB Cares, LAC Minerals, Procure Plus. So join us in Paraguay or online as we continue delivering at scale and impact for Latin America and the Caribbean.